Everyone, welcome to the June, I'm thinking already of the end of the academic year, the January Faculty Colloquium. And today I am privileged to introduce Dr. Michael Fields. Just a little bit of background for you. Dr. Fields, and we're very proud in the College of Business to say Dr. Fields because recently he did complete all of the work to secure his PhD. So Dr. Fields, congratulations. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Mike holds a Bachelor of Science in Media Arts and Sciences, a Master's in Business Administration from the University of Indianapolis, and his doctorate in Global Leadership from Indiana Institute of Technology. Originally, Mike is from Indianapolis, Indiana, and before moving to LeGrand 5 years ago, he was teaching in and managing the business program at New Mexico State University, Grants, oddly enough in Grants, New Mexico. Prior to entering academia over 10 years ago, Fields worked and consulted in numerous industries, including municipalities, retail, not-for-profits, transportation, construction, web design, food service, and more. This experience has obviously provided him with a lot of knowledge that he brings to the classroom on a daily basis. His current teaching load includes lower-level introductory courses through in the EOU MBA program as well. He is currently Senior Instructor of General Business and member of the Management Faculty Group in the College of Business. And in addition to his teaching, he serves on many college committees and university committees and is a member of the LeGrand Main Street Business Development Committee. His research interests, as you're going to see today, include global leadership, intercultural and global competence, emotional intelligence, global citizenship, study abroad, and servant leadership. And when Mike is not teaching, he can be found coaching one of the many area youth sports teams in LeGrand community, including football, basketball, baseball, softball, and more. So please, once again, welcome Dr. Fields to the January Colloquium.
Thank you for that introduction there. It's always nice when someone smarter than you introduces you. They make you sound really good. So thank you everyone for coming out this afternoon. I know 4 o'clock, a lot of people are ready to head home. Those of you tuning in online, thank you for tuning in and taking your time to attend. So the impact of pre-college characteristics in the college experience and study abroad and students' intercultural competence. Really long title. Devon had to ask me if they could shorten it to get it to fit on the screen. So as Professor Keller indicated, this is mostly from my dissertation. So I've pretty much been immersed in this literature and work for the last, long time. 3 years or more, to say the least. So basically, the reason I decided to look at this is that the workforce today is global. Whether we're in LeGrand, Oregon, whether we're in Portland, we're in Chicago, we're in London, it doesn't matter where we're at. We're in a global workforce. And to be competitive as an employee, to be a worker, you've got to have these intercultural and global competencies. To gain these needed competencies, what we have to do is, in higher education, we have to do a better job of providing the intercultural competence piece, because intercultural competence is a prerequisite for the global competencies needed to be successful today. Several articles have been produced or published regarding higher education's need to address this. One report shows that the expansion of multinational corporations in about a 20-year period grew from 3,000 to 63,000. At the same time, the GDP for the U.S. Improved. Gotta check my numbers here. They produced about 31% of that private sector GDP growth over that same time. And then just as recent as a little over 2 years ago now, a third of the CEOs in these multinational companies reported they had to cancel their global initiatives because their workforce couldn't handle that task. So what that says is during this period of growth over the last, going on 30 years now, The labor force hasn't kept up with that. So to help with that, higher education needs to be able to address some of these needs by providing these intercultural competencies so that the employees and employers can grow the global competencies after graduation. So intercultural competence, a term that we need to define. Basically, this is a combination of skills like communication skills, relationship skills, traits like inquisitiveness or empathy and charisma, and some of these behaviors that help us manage things in times of uncertainty or anxiety. In order to develop intercultural competence, individuals have to have contact in a positive and high contact environment with people that are different than they are. So to support that and the development of these intercultural competence skills is contact theory, which is based on the premise that contact between individuals that belong to different groups can foster the development of more positive out-group attitudes. And it was originally theorized a long time ago in 1954 and had to meet these 4 conditions in order for this contact to be positive and for the results to be what they needed to be. They have to have equal group status, common goals, intergroup cooperation, and the support of authorities. So a member of one group basically can't be in a position of authority over the other individuals. Additionally, intercultural competence is a lifelong process. This isn't like some skills where we learn it and we stay there. We're going to kind of ebb and flow. And additionally, interculturalists don't have one single definition that everyone agrees on in the literature, but everyone does somewhat agree that the development of competence in one culture provides an opportunity into your own native culture. So using this idea of intergroup contact theory and intercultural competence, if we have positive and high contact with people different than us, it should improve our intercultural competence. If we go through periods of low contact, no contact, or negative contact with people different than us, in theory, we're going to swing the other way on that pendulum. So the question explored is what impact do pre-college characteristics and college experiences have on intercultural competence of university students? It's important to note college experience would include study abroad, but later you're going to see we break that out as its own independent variable. So what's the literature tell us? Over the past several decades, there's been a lot of initiatives throughout the U.S. to improve the intercultural competence and to internationalize the curriculum of U.S. colleges and campuses around the country. Some of those efforts are intercultural centers, participation in study abroad, bringing international students to U.S. campuses. A little more recently, though, the research shows that's not as effective as we once thought it was. In one particular study, the Salisbury, Ann, and Pasquarella, they looked at a longitudinal data set and found that some of these pre-college experiences or pre-college traits and characteristics, as well as experience during college, was probably as effective, if not more effective, than study abroad participation, which we'll explain that in a little bit. Just another report here, AAC&U, which many people here at EOU should be familiar with. The Association of American Colleges and Universities, their Greater Expectations report identified that we should be creating settings that foster an understanding and connectedness to global issues, as well as their LEAP, the National Councils on Liberal Education in America's Promise, identified that universities should include outcomes for global and civic knowledge and engagement, as well as intercultural knowledge and competence. And again, LEAP is pretty important because the research was conducted at a public liberal arts university in a LEAP participating state, which there's 13 of those throughout the US. So this research was conducted under the idea of global leadership, and not every student who graduates from a university is planning to be a global leader, but all students should be aspiring to be a global citizen. And so it's important to note that, because global citizenship includes global awareness, which is understanding and appreciation of oneself in the world and world issues, social responsibility or a concern for others in society and the environment, and civic engagement with active engagement with local, regional, national, and global issues. And again, since not everyone is going to aspire to take a position of leadership in their career, they should all be looking to be working in this global environment, so they should be trying to become a more globally engaged citizen. Here's that study that looked at these pre-college characteristics in that longitudinal data set, and they identified some of these pre-college characteristics, which would include race and gender, socioeconomic status, positive attitude towards literacy, and then the literature on intercultural competence mentions a language immersion component in gaining intercultural competence. The impact of college experience has been examined quite a bit. These two guys, Pasquarella and Terenzini, they looked at over 2,600 studies in 2 different time periods and found out that most students do have some change in their development of attitudes and awareness of cultural things around them. Additionally, it's been found that a moderate increase of dimensions of cultural awareness occurs just by attending college. So just being in a college setting, being on a college campus does impact the student's cultural awareness. So intercultural competence has been around for quite a while, and the research has really kind of positioned itself into 3 different kind of channels. The first stream is one of the largest streams and kind of categorize it as competence as personal traits. The second stream looks at it as intercultural attitudes and worldviews. And the third stream looks at it as a set of intercultural capabilities or knowledge, skills, and abilities people use in an intercultural context. And out of that came the concept of cultural intelligence, which CQ has been used quite a bit recently as kind of a buzzword, kind of that popular term, and really has been around for quite some time before CQ was kind of out there. But out of that, 2 overarching antecedents or predictors of intercultural competence have kind of emerged in the literature. The first one is personality traits. The other one is cultural experiences. And this is pointed out because while there's really interesting stuff that has to do with the big 5 personality traits and intercultural competence, we were really looking at the experiences impacting intercultural competence. So we just wanted to acknowledge that that's there, but we're really looking at experiences before college, during college, and even then in the workforce after graduation. So how do we conduct this research? So we wanted to assess these pre-college characteristics and how they impacted students' intercultural competence. So for a long time, higher education has, in some ways, relied upon study abroad as being, hey, we're helping our students become interculturally competent. We're going to encourage them to study abroad. And that's great. There's nothing wrong with that. However, some of the more recent data shows some of these other things are just as impactful, sometimes even more impactful on a student's intercultural competence. So what are these pre-college characteristics? We mentioned a few earlier: gender, race, academic preparation, generally use scores on SATs or something along those lines, parents' educational attainment, socioeconomic status, which we'll define a little bit further later, and a positive attitude towards literacy. College experience includes college major, co-curricular involvement, diverse experiences and interactions, as well as integrative learning experiences. And these are pulled directly and adapted from Salisbury's study in 2013, the Wabash National Study that that group did. Additionally, we added, there was about 42 total items which included these variables here, as well as some other demographic information on language, if they participated in study abroad, were they satisfied with their study abroad trips, have they traveled abroad for leisure, have they lived abroad for anything else, and language and some other demographic information, including whether or not their parents have traveled abroad, lived abroad, or speak more than one language. So the research sample, using convenience sample from an undergraduate university and a LEAP university in the Pacific Northwest, included a snowball method, which just basically means we really wanted to make sure we wanted study abroad participants to be included. So the international student coordinator contacted study abroad students, and we ended up capturing about 17 participants indicated they had participated in study abroad. Doesn't sound like 17's a lot, but when we went to the university's data, they had tracked about 35 students in the kind of time frame of students in the population, and they had tracked 35 students, so we grabbed almost half of the students that were known to have studied abroad. So there was a pretty reasonable representation of those students. Did some analysis, SPSS, frequency testing on categorical data, exploratory factor analysis was used, which we're going to talk about in a minute, and we calculated eigenvalues to determine the factors that were really what represented these independent variables of pre-college characteristics, college experience, and study abroad as its own standalone variable. The internal reliability on the assessment that we use for intercultural competence, which is the Myville-Guzman Universality Diversity Scale, or MGUDS because it's a lot shorter to use the acronym there. That was tested at a Cronbach's alpha of 0.855, and usually as long as we're above 0.7, statistically we feel like we're pretty reliable there. So what did we find? This is the fun part, okay? So the 42 demographic items, 15 items on the MGUDS short form. We had 162 participants start the survey, and probably the guy that designed it, maybe the guy presenting right now, had a continue button, and we lost a few people. They didn't hit continue. So we had about a 90%, 91% completion rate, and of that, we had about 71% female, 77% identified as white or Caucasian, and to capture that ethnicity information, we utilized the U.S. Census data definitions. 61%, almost 62% were 18 to 25, which isn't too surprising when you're studying undergraduate students at a university. About 55% either met or received the federal Pell Grant. And all these numbers are important because all of these kind of correlate directly to this pre-college characteristic category. 16% indicated that they had lived outside of their current country of residence, which again is important because that's one of the variables that we were testing. almost 75% spoke only one language, and the remaining 24% said they spoke 2 languages, and we actually had options for them to choose 3, 4, or more languages. And again, that's important because the previous intercultural competence literature had this language immersion component, and we'll see later how that worked out for us. So first, we needed to figure out how do all these items in this survey actually correlate, or do they correlate to represent these independent variables. So we did some factor analysis on the pre-college characteristic items, which were 15 items in the survey. And we identified the 2 areas that really showed the biggest correlation to intercultural competence scores were the socioeconomic status and if they have lived or traveled abroad, outside of study abroad. To calculate the SES variable, we took the threshold for the Pell Grant as well as parents' educational attainment and combined those scores to create that kind of major variable to represent the pre-college characteristics. Then we took foreign travel and living variable for the participants as well as their parents and combined those scores to create the variable to represent foreign travel and living. And that does not include study abroad because that was asked in a separate item on the survey. For the college experience, there were about 6 questions that related to their campus involvement and classroom involvement. So we found out that the questions that related to campus cultural and diversity events correlated the most to represent that college experience. So we took the items related to those topics and combined those to create one variable to represent the college experience. Something that we found interesting was participation in study abroad was statistically basically insignificant. We didn't really get much correlation. However, we did find the students who participated in study abroad and indicated they were satisfied with their study abroad trip, as well as all the preparation leading up to the trip and post-trip, actually had a greater correlation to their scores than those that just indicated they were neutral or perhaps dissatisfied with their trips. So we took the questions about that, combined that to represent study abroad, and then we compared some scores here. So once we created those major variables, we went after our hypotheses to test those and see if what we thought was true. So to do that, we used hierarchical multiple regression, which is this really fun statistical analysis that somebody had to help me set up. So what we did there is we took that dependent variable of intercultural competence and loaded that in, and then one step at a time we loaded these other variables. And so the first step loaded study abroad satisfaction. The second step loaded campus diversity and cultural events representing our college experience. And then we loaded the two pre-college characteristics of the SES and the foreign travel and living. So the most significant result happened when we loaded in that variable representing pre-college characteristics of the foreign travel and living. So what this really says, so for the statistics people out there, change in R-square or adjusted R-square basically is just measuring how much variance in scores based on loading that variable to the model happened. And so about 23%, 22% of the change in scores, positive scores, so higher scores in intercultural competence, occurred when the participants who indicated this foreign travel and living in their results. So then we repeated that because remember the original question was study abroad participation, and we were using study abroad satisfaction. So we went back and simply replaced that first variable on study abroad with the single question in the survey that said, have you participated in study abroad? When we put that in there and replaced that satisfaction variable, essentially we had very little statistical increase in scores. So there was minimal change when they just participated in study abroad and did not indicate they were satisfied with their trip. So then we'll go through the different, the 6 hypotheses that we tested. First one was students with just study abroad experience would not show greater intercultural competence scores than students with specific pre-college characteristics and college experiences. And what we found is just study abroad participation did not really have any impact at all, or did not positively impact their intercultural competence scores. So does this mean we should not encourage students to study abroad? No. Study abroad is still a good thing, okay? It just means it didn't impact in this research. So again, when we looked at this, study abroad participation, study abroad satisfaction, minimal impacts on scores. So we could say that just participation in study abroad does not impact intercultural competence scores. Next, we looked at students with pre-college characteristics having greater intercultural competence scores than students with study abroad. And when we loaded in the 2 variables representing that, the socioeconomic status and the foreign travel and living, we did see a significant increase when we combined the change in R for both of those variables. About 26% of the change in the score was attributed to those 2 variables. So that would support that pre-college, specific pre-college characteristics can impact, is probably how I should word this in the future, intercultural competence scores. Then we looked at the college experiences. So again, we did the same thing as we loaded those in. And when we loaded in the campus cultural and diversity events variable, very minimal results, statistically insignificant results in the change in scores. So we would say that those specific college experiences do not have the greater impact than what we, so it would not support that hypothesis. Then we get into the combining those variables. Then we looked at students with specific pre-college characteristics and study abroad and how that impacted their intercultural competence scores. And on the surface, we kind of think maybe it does, but if we think back to those previous couple of analyses, the majority of the change in scores occurred from the one variable. So when we look at that, and we look at the previous confirmation of H1, really H3 is not supported because it wasn't really the combination. The majority of that change, approximately 90% of that change or variance came just from the one variable, not the combination of those variables. So with that, we would not support H3. Then we looked at the combination of college experience and study abroad participation. And again, very minimal change. We already know that when we looked at those independently, there was statistically no change. So it would be pretty safe to say that the combination of those two does not have significant positive impact. Then we get even more complicated here. We're going to look at all three of those variables: pre-college characteristics, the college experience, and study abroad. So if we look at all that R change, and we already know that we didn't support a couple of those hypotheses, we're probably wanting to say, well, when you combine them all, it's not going to. So we went back to the data, and we looked at the individual scores and the sample of students that met all three of those conditions. About 24 students or so who had in some way, shape, or form had some study abroad experience or indicated they had study abroad. They met those specific pre-college characteristics of socioeconomic status and foreign travel or living, and they had those campus cultural and diversity events all as part of what their experiences had been. And we looked at the raw scores of their outcome on the MGoods and found out their scores, the overall sample score was about 70.29 out of a 90 on this assessment. The students, the population that met all three of those conditions, their score was almost 3% higher. So from that, we would say students that have all of those three experiences are going to have greater intercultural competence scores, or higher, I should say, scores, than those with just one or maybe two of those experiences. So we did support H5, saying that all three variables combined does show greater intercultural competence scores than just participation in study abroad. So I have to admit, this is the first time I've used these images that I created about 3 years ago. Okay, so I was kind of happy to do this today. So many times in higher education, we think if we provide, or if students meet one of these things, they should have higher intercultural competence. But what really happens is it's not one alone, it's a combination of them. So where we have overlap here, the scores are slightly higher than just students that fall into one of the categories. But where we find the greatest scores are when they meet all three of these conditions. They have specific pre-college characteristics, they have specific college experience, and then I would add, it's not just participation in study abroad, it's if they're satisfied with their study abroad trip. So now what's all that mean for us? It means a lot, actually. So it does indicate that these college experiences and pre-college characteristics will impact their scores on intercultural competence. One of the most interesting, and weren't even looking for it, finds was that satisfaction component of study abroad. However, also interesting was that we found the students that indicated that they spoke more than one language, or their parents spoke more than one language, statistically had almost no significant higher scores than those who indicated one language, which was really surprising because about 40 years worth of literature said otherwise. So more research in the future for anybody interested in that. Pre-college characteristics with the most impact were socioeconomic status and foreign travel and living. If we think that through, kind of makes sense. Those higher socioeconomic status are more likely to be able to travel and or live abroad. So there is a bit of a common sense correlation perhaps there. The SES scores of parent educational attainment and the not qualifying or meeting the threshold or receiving Pell Grant was what the indicators were for that socioeconomic status. And then the greatest overall impact were those people or those participants that indicated they've lived or traveled abroad was the greatest impact on the scores. And again, that would probably be supported from the literature As a lot of the intercultural competence literature says, contact with those different than us, so go to a country different than your home country, should impact your scores on intercultural competence. So this overall study abroad satisfaction, having one of the greater impacts, what that tells us in higher education is we could probably look at our study abroad programming, how it's run, what kind of pre-trip planning do we do, what events and experiences are they having on the sojourn itself, what kind of post-trip follow-up is there, among other things. We could also look at the foreign travel and living. Where did they live? Where did they travel? Same could be said for study abroad. The length of time living abroad, the length of time studying abroad, the length of time living abroad. So all of these things could help us get more data to kind of figure out what it is that is really impacting the students. Where they travel also has an impact on that. Cultures that are much more different than your native culture are shown to be a little bit more of a greater impact than those that are more similar than your native culture. So those are some future data points to look at. So just the final remarks here. Universities across the US and higher education, we need to be putting in some of these better practices to make sure our students are leaving with intercultural competence skills necessary to navigate today's work environment. Looking at some of the results from this, we can improve some of our programming on campuses here and everywhere across the US. And one project from this, I piloted last spring and then did some research this past fall, and I'm writing on that right now, so perhaps a future presentation, trying to figure out things like how can we bring intercultural and global experiences to the classroom, to the campus, for those who can't live abroad, can't travel abroad, can't study abroad. And so that's something, kind of a future implication, perhaps to help universities improve the skills that students need as they leave. And as a good scholar, I've got several slides of references to show that I didn't make all this up. I did actually do some research. And to the most important slide, what questions do you have? Yes, Tanya. I'll moderate myself here.
Not that you can't hear me, but online people can. I was just curious, you kept saying we. Did you complete this project in conjunction with someone else, or you're referring to your committee, perhaps? Okay.
Yeah.
And then the second piece is another variable that I think has significant impact on cultural competency and self-reflection of cultural competency, because usually we're self-rating, is not only where they went, but linguistic competency perhaps going into a study abroad situation. If there was frustration with language and communication or whatever, that might also negatively impact. So that correlation would also be really interesting to me as a linguist. But I thought your information was really informative, and it's exciting to see it's not a one and done experience, because I think it is ongoing, and it is a continuum over time in our own development. So.
And your point on frustration with learning language would fall right in line with that negative contact, because that would be very similar to negative experience with someone different than you. So a negative experience learning a language would be that negative or low contact. So that would fall right in line with that, yes. Yes.
I thought it was really interesting that the study abroad and the family-based travel were different. So I'm wondering what might contribute to that difference, and if study abroad isn't sort of generating as much impact as the family travel, can we make changes to it that would enhance it?
I would be speculating with this answer. I don't have the data to back it up. One of the indicators from the literature is study abroad is often very packed in Oftentimes there's a very busy itinerary, and so students who are on a study abroad sojourn are so busy just keeping up with the itinerary, they don't actually have the opportunity to go experience the culture of wherever they're at. On the flip side, when you travel abroad for vacation or other leisure, or you live somewhere else, you're immersed in that culture. And so that's just one assumption of, based on the literature of why that happens. There's a time element that we know for sure as well. Short-term study abroad is usually more impactful than, say, a semester abroad. Anything up to about 6 weeks or anything 6 months or longer is shown to be more impactful than anything in between that time frame. And it has to do with your curiosity in those 6 weeks. You're exploring around roughly 6 weeks. You kind of are there, and maybe you're homesick, and you get frustrated, and it becomes that negative experience. Around 6 months, you've experienced a half a year. You've kind of gone through a few different cycles of the seasons. You've experienced a lot more. So there's this kind of numb period in between. So, great question. Thank you.
In your category called college experiences, I heard you define it as college experiences and events.
Mm-hmm.
Was that the definition?
There's several things. So there were questions, items on the survey that asked about integrative learning experiences, cultural events on campus. There were about 6 total questions. Through the exploratory factor analysis, we found the questions that referred to the cultural events and diversity events were the ones that strongly correlated to the higher scores of intercultural competence.
Yeah, I just wondered, was there a question that included taking a course on intercultural competence?
It didn't. The question, and I don't have them memorized, I don't think there was a question specifically asking about a course. It asked more in the terms of, in the past 6 months, have you discussed global or intercultural topics in your coursework?
Right.
So it was more of a broad question than a specific to one class.
Because I'm thinking that we do have this DPD requirement for graduation in place that requires students to take courses that are intentionally trying to teach intercultural competence. And for future, it might be interesting to try to suss that out and see if there's a future correlation between the work that we're trying to do for the very reason that you're talking about in the DPD courses versus going to a campus event like African drumming or to International Student Show. It's culture as entertainment, which isn't necessarily going to cause any significant new insights into cultural diversity.
2 things. One, yes, I would love to pre and post on certain classes. That would be great. Just great data points to throw into the data set. And 2 would be most indicators show it's a combination of all of those things. It's the coursework, it's the conversations in the hallway, it's the sitting in a classroom with an international student and having a deep conversation with them. That's kind of what I did this fall, was what was termed the Cultural Mentoring Project. And we brought in 5 international MBA students to a Introduction to Business class, and once a week they met and in one of our classrooms in Zabel and had conversations about culture. And I've got the data on that I'm slowly plugging through, and preliminary results show that it was impactful. So.
Right, but you were intentionally trying to break down those barriers. In most of our classrooms, it's very
Correct.
hard to break down those barriers between students of difference or often isolate themselves and stay with others. And in our DPD courses, as you in your program, you were intentionally trying to get students to reach across the aisle, if you will.
Yep.
So,
It was an intentional research intervention, so to speak, to have them participate in these events, yes.
Did you say that the Pell Grant question was indeed a predictor?
Especially when combined with parent educational attainment. to
So
represent.
it would be kind of like, I'm trying to interpret that, you know,
Essentially, higher income, so
Right.
not meeting the threshold would indicate a greater intercultural competence, essentially because a family would have the financial means to have cultural experiences, whether that's trips to the museum, whether that's trips abroad, more inclined to watch international news or whatever that may be. So education and income combined. Yes.
So when thinking through this, and I might not necessarily phrase it the best, but I guess I would have some concerns with qualifying those. Like I wonder what's valued with the score and the layers of privilege and power that might be inherent in that, with saying that those who have the higher SES and have the means to be able to explore, that they would be, have the most to bring to the table potentially based on that score. I think that potentially it's discounting the assets that people could bring, but it's just that the tool values more, like maybe the tool shows privilege and power that's already in place, that then those experiences are going to show it more. But wondering if there's assets that are not captured with the tool that could be brought to the table. And again, I don't know how to fully capture that, but it's just like, I can feel that there's something not quite right with that needs to be further explored when considering students and what they have to bring to the table, and knowing that the professions that they go into sometimes value what is already the privilege and power in place rather than what could be.
When you refer to tool, are you referring to
The cultural competence score and showing that those who had the higher SES and the travel abroad experiences prior because their families had the means to do that, and then they had the higher cultural competency score. So that was based on some type of a tool or indicator that would say they had the
the
higher.
assessment on intercultural competence doesn't ask anything about income or Pell Grant or anything like that. That was collected in its own separate item in a demographic survey. And then we just looked for correlation on those scores, whether or not if they met or received. The question simply read something to the effect of, do you receive or meet the threshold to receive the federal Pell Grant? And so that's kind of just a national standard that is used in socioeconomic measurements. And so if they answered yes, generally it indicated a lower score. If they answered no, they do not meet that, it generally indicated a slightly higher score. So it's just simply correlation.
But I think the tool what's valued on the tool might naturally correlate, and there might be things missing that could be on the tool that would highlight what others have to bring to the table that didn't have as much privilege, is what I'm wondering about. And how, because even, I think there's more to.
There's a social
unpack there.
desirability check in the assessment tool. The validity and reliability of it, it's been developed and used for over 30 years, and there's data on it, from 30 years ago, that it is generally considered a reliable assessment tool. And the way the questions are phrased on the intercultural competence assessment, I don't see how they're broad, and there would be no indication of income or anything like that on just those 15 questions, I think is what you're saying it's missing of.
What they view and what they're valuing as intercultural competence, there could be different ways to define that. And that tool might be set up to value the definitions that are already created by people with that higher level of privilege. And so, like with those in power, they might say this is what we value as intercultural. There might be other assets of intercultural that aren't valued and not captured on that assessment because they're not valued, but that they could be a great asset. But they're just not recognized because it's just perpetuating what's already in place in power. So again, it's without me knowing the research, but it's just something that those results make me think about or make me curious about.
Sure.
To wonder more.
Okay, thank you. Anyone Okay. I mean, if not, we just have time to eat more brownies.
Okay, I found you had 5 traits of cultural intelligence: extroversion, agreeableness, conscientiousness, emotional stability, and open to new experience. I worry because I'm not an extrovert and I have no emotional stability, so I think my CQ is probably low. But yeah, that extroversion piece is interesting to me. Because in our culture it means that idea of extroversion, right? That ability to be outgoing, right? I don't know who created those features of cultural intelligence. I think my question is kind of like Amanda's, but more like, what about those in other words, how do you make someone who is never going to be extroverted? Can the word be different, or can the concept be different, because there are people who are never going to be that, right? But might have cultural intelligence. How do you teach extroversion? Whereas it might be learning to go outside of, in other words, I don't know what the concept would be, but there's got to be another concept of it. Nancy and I are agreeing because we're introverts on the personality scale classic, right? What we've developed extroverted personalities in order to teach. I don't know how to teach extroversion, or how to get students there. It's a fascinating concept to me because I know a lot of students in my classes who struggle because they are by temperament quite self-possessed and reserved and silent by nature and will never be that. But so I don't know what to say about that other than that made me curious and interested.
So those 5 or so that were mentioned as characteristics are one of, and I have not looked at this number recently, but probably I think 127 terms used over the various models of intercultural competence. And so those few terms that were used on that slide were simply to demonstrate some of the characteristics. There's a list that's very long, and there's several models of intercultural competence, and I reviewed too many of them to mention right now. Literally, there's a book that just reviews them all, and I reviewed that book among others. So to answer that question, I had a similar conversation about 2 days ago. So that introverted person who maybe isn't interested in going out and physically experiencing events or whatever that is different than them, or in that group of people different with them, how they could gain that same experience could be pulled from literature, could be pulled from watching the news. So basically we just have to recategorize what the experience is for that individual. And so the resources that they would utilize versus me, I'm going to go to that event that's going to have people I'm more extroverted, to where the introverted person is going to be at home during that event, but they can still get it by reading the news, reading literature, watching foreign films, watching foreign news, and different things like that. So there are ways. We're not necessarily having to teach them to be extroverted. We have to teach them how to get the experience to still gain the same intercultural contact as those that would be extroverted.
Thank you, Michael. I thought it was interesting that you talked about the experiences abroad in other cultures that were much more different than your own. I wondered if you also looked at age of the experience, and if there was much difference, if somebody went abroad or into another culture when they were younger as opposed to older. I'm thinking about my own kids. I took them to South America at 13 and 11, but maybe they would have done better if we went a little later, for example.
Just based on this research alone, we didn't find any correlation with age of the experiences. the literature would support the idea that, in your case, your kids traveling abroad at an early age, they would probably come into a university setting with a higher score of intercultural competence. And they would be more likely to participate in the events on campus, and they would be more likely to participate in study abroad, is what the literature says. Is those who have those experiences before college are more likely to participate in those events during college, and therefore leave with an even higher score upon graduation. So that would be about the only age element that was really looked at.
Sorry, very cool study. Was this the Melville-Guzman diversity scale, or was it different?
Yes.
Awesome.
Melville-Guzman Universality Diversity short form.
Yeah. It's a little different, but I use that scale for people with disability. And one of the big things we noticed was the quality of like knowledge before experience. So that might be interesting. A lot of times people go and study abroad, but they don't necessarily learn about the culture before. So kind of looking into that.
Yeah, that would be that kind of what I refer to as pre-trip planning.
Yeah.
Is it tied to a course to where you've spent, you know, in our case, 10 weeks learning about it before you travel? Or do you sign up, jump on a plane, and fly away, and you really didn't plan before you left? There's definitely indicators saying that that preparation before the trip has an impact. I didn't actually pull that out of this data set, didn't really measure for that, but that's something down the road that we're definitely looking to measure.
Awesome. Also, I teach a cultural competency class, so it'd be really cool to partner with you.
Let's do it.
Hi there, Sid Rangel, Spanish teacher at La Grande High School. I'm just wondering if there's any past experience from high school leading up to the college or the university. So I'm just curious if there's any measure in earlier on, or like say their junior or senior year of high school leading up to, or how many years of experiences have they had up to the to their point to measure that intercultural competency.
Excuse me. We didn't measure for anything we didn't ask specifically. So there could be a future, research to study, particularly I know you lead study abroad, to study your students pre-trip, post-trip, into college, through college, after college, because they would be exposed and again have some experience, have that curiosity, have that interest in these other events based on their experience, assuming it's positive, right? Assuming they're satisfied, then once they got to college, they would be more likely to participate in other events and other classes and activities that would most likely impact as well. So most likely, the students you're referring to and that you're teaching are probably going to show up as a college freshman with a slightly higher score than the average college student, and then are going to leave with an even greater score than the average college student would leave with. So no, we didn't address that here, but that's definitely a future point. Anyone else? Looks like we've exhausted our questions. So thank you for coming. Thanks for the wonderful questions.